Welcome back. In our last sessions, we've discussed what institutional advancement is, and we've talked about the 3 R's of reputation building, recruitment, and resource development. And we've also talked about the 4 P's, the people, the processes, the products, and the positioning of an institution and how they fit into the advancement program. In this session, we're going to turn our attention to community engagement, which is another very important piece of the puzzle. Community engagement is that two-way process that emphasizes both talking to the community, but just as importantly, listening to the community. And we're going to see, as we talked about in our last session, that one of the most important aspects of community engagement is to assess the needs of the community so that you can respond with programs and services that meet that need. So welcome back, Al. And as I said, last session we talked about the importance of learning about your community and to determine the current and also the emerging needs in the community, which suggests that we all need to be a little bit of a futurist. How can a community college go about accomplishing this?
Yeah, I think there are several ways to do that. I'd like to focus on 3, though, today in this session. One of those would be public opinion surveys. A second would be business climate surveys. And then a third would be something that I've heard go by under different names, but the one I like is a community conversation. So let's spend our time today looking at those 3.
Okay, let's start with public opinion surveys. Macomb put a very heavy emphasis on public opinion surveys. We did them twice a year and put a lot of time and effort into crafting the right questions. How did you get that started?
You know, actually, this is a story that probably isn't as glamorous as you might think it would be, but driving to work one morning, I heard a drive time news radio talk show talk about the results of something from the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research. They had done a statewide survey and they were reporting out on what they had found as far as the attitudes and thoughts of the people statewide on a couple of topics. And, you know, as we talked in our previous session, not all communities are the same, and you know, I was saying, boy, I mean, those are probably true on a statewide basis, but I don't know if that's how the people of Macomb County would think. Gee, I wonder how they would think if they were asked the same questions. So getting to work that day, I think we pulled a couple of people together and talked about the Institute for Social Research survey and asked ourselves, I wonder if we could ask similar questions of the people here in Macomb County, see how they feel, and see how they compare to what the people in Michigan feel. So not a very glamorous beginning, but we did launch the survey. We happened to be blessed with a woman on staff who was teaching mathematics part-time, who happened to work previously for a professional market opinion research company, so she knew the techniques. And working with a small supplemental contract, she led our very first, came to be known as the Macomb Opinion Survey, or MOS. And at the time that I retired from the presidency, we had just completed our 44th Macomb Opinion Survey.
Was that a scientific survey? Can you tell us about the methodology?
Yeah, that one we decided we really wanted it to be scientific. We wanted to make sure we had the proper sample. We chose a sufficient number of people. I think that was between 400 and 500 people for a county our size that would give us a confidence level of plus or minus 4 to 5%. And we figured from a cost-benefit standpoint for what it would cost to do 400 to 500, at that time, telephone surveys would probably give us a significant level of confidence so that we could put some faith in the results.
You talked a little bit about who conducted the Macomb Opinion Surveys. What did they try to discover?
Well, we talked about that a lot, and I think I would like to say we were smart enough to know the best first question to ask, but I wouldn't say we really did at the time. We may have stumbled into it. But the lead-off question, just as you mentioned in our previous session about the pilots that you surveyed through SurveyMonkey, was an open-ended question, and it was very simple. What do you think is the #1 problem facing the people of Macomb County today? And we looked for their responses. Now again, this was a telephone survey when it first began, so we had to manually go through and kind of sort those out. But nonetheless, that was the lead-off question. So the first thing we searched for is, what do you think is the #1 problem? We didn't try to steer them in any direction. What's the #1 problem? The second thing we tried to look for were trends. I remember back before this internet age, and people were just getting home computers and just for the first time getting access to the internet through dial-up access. We were very curious about what was the rate in which that technology was being adopted in the community. So for several surveys in a row, we would ask them, do you have a home computer? If you do you have access to the internet? If you have access, what kind of access do you have? And it gave us a sense of how quickly we could begin migrating. Not only was it a good question just to know the facts, but if we wanted to begin migrating some of our advancement effort toward technology, how ready was our community to begin receiving information in that new form? We also, from time to time, would use it as a way of determining reputational questions. We actually would ask them flat out, how well do you think Macomb County or Macomb College is doing on A, B, or C, and give us a rating scale. And then we also, from time to time, had some very special interest target areas that we were examining for the moment, and we would incorporate that. So it was kind of a rotating basis for each survey, but I can tell you this, for 44 observations over 28 or 29 years, the leadoff question was always, what's the number one problem facing the people of Macomb County today?
And I am remembering that for many, many years, jobs, unemployment, and taxes were the three top issues. Now you have a different view as Assistant County Executive. Looking at the community today, are there a different set of issues, or have those pervaded as the ongoing issues?
Well, I think what happens is you'll never get a single answer, but here's what I can tell you from 44 surveys, and then I'll try to compare it to today. The frequency with which a response was mentioned varied substantially. Sometimes the number one problem wasn't even mentioned by 1 in 5 residents. But at its high point, and this was in a period of extremely high taxation when there was a lot of concern over tax reform in Michigan, and the other one was during the depths of economic recessions, the number one problem was cited by more than 40% of the residents. So there's always going to be a multiple answer, but I think what we tried to look for in there was the intensity of it. What I'm finding in Macomb County today is clearly we're coming off a time nationally in Michigan, in Macomb, where jobs and employment is number one as far as what's the number one problem facing people today. But what we're beginning to experience through the surveying we do at the county is that that's mitigating somewhat, and you wind up with these multiple levels of issues, none of them rising to like 50% of the people say this is the number one problem.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
If we were to do a survey today and find that jobs, unemployment, and taxes were the number one issues, let's think about some examples of how a community college might take that feedback and turn it into a communications program.
Yeah, I think what ideally, we said in our very first session that all organizations work on behalf of someone. And that someone, we can call them stakeholders, but clearly a community college works on behalf of its community. So one of the questions is, if you want to have the public really feel the benefit of that institution, then if they can perceive that institution is one of the solutions to their problems, they're going to have greater regard for that organization. So what we would do at Macomb, and I mean, if I were there today, I would continue doing it, every time we learned what the top problem was, we tried to refocus the information we sent out from the institution to show we were a solution to that. If jobs and unemployment was high, we would showcase retraining. One of the ones I can remember, I'm not sure if you were still there then or following that, but for some reason, for 2 surveys in a row, safety became a high priority. They were concerned just about safe neighborhoods and so on. Why, I don't know. Maybe it was something that was publicized. But what we immediately did is every cover of everything we sent out had a police officer, firefighter, emergency medical technician, because we never said we are a solution to your problem. But we began to show how the college prepared police officers and firefighters and emergency medical personnel. So we continued to position Macomb College in the public's mind, subliminally in some cases, as being a solution to the top problem they told us they had.
So you can do this type of research and then very directly translate it into a communications program. And I think the point you're making is very important, because in most organizations that don't have a very highly structured communications program, what ends up happening is you put out what I call the message of the day. somebody walks in and they say, people don't know us for X, so let's talk about X, or people don't know us for Y, so let's talk about that now. And those kinds of messages pervade your advertising and your press releases and all kinds of things. What you're saying, again, to recap, is you're saying it's very important to understand the concerns of the community, and then instead of picking from a vast array of messages you can put out, making sure that you're communicating to that community the programs and services you offer that are a solution to their problem.
Sure. I think that's exactly the case. You know, if someone were to go to one of our speech faculty today and say, tell me what I should think about most if I want to make a good speech, one of the first things they're going to say is, know your audience. Who are you speaking to? And if you then know that audience and speak to that audience, right off the bat, you're going to be a lot further ahead than if you're talking about something they couldn't have a concern about in the world. And that's what our communication program was. I can remember someone told me this story, and this is a long time ago, but about how you should know your audience. He said, when you're with a butcher, talk about meat. And when you're with a baker, talk about bread. And the smart aleck said, well, what happens if they're both in the room? And he says, well, then talk about sandwiches. So, I mean,
that's a great story.
But it comes down to what's on their mind, not what's on your mind, what's on their mind, and how can you begin then to talk to them about what's on your mind in terms of what's on their mind. And I think that's what leads to this success in the communications plan.
And the Macomb Opinion Survey, which was done by the Center for Community Studies, was of great interest to the news media. How did you did not decide to just keep that information inside, but to share it with others? How did that help your overall advancement efforts in positioning the college?
Sure, in two ways. I mean, one is when we saw the results of it and became more comfortable with our results and were satisfied that we had a sample that would pass scrutiny, through a scientific sample, we did begin to kind of test the waters by letting the news media know, and they did take great interest in this. So what did that do? I mean, we became yet another resource to the community, in this case an intellectual resource, as we talked about last time. But more importantly, we opened the door to say, well, we're going to be doing this survey anyway, and I can recall talking to some of the local media outlets and saying, would you like us to ask any particular question in this next survey that you might have interest in? And I can remember they took us up on that. Well, immediately when the survey results were known, you had immediate press coverage because some of their questions that they wanted asked, we had the results to.
And it was friendly coverage.
And it was friendly coverage. Exactly, yep.
Oh, well, let's talk about the business climate survey for a moment.
Sure. Well, I mentioned in our first interview that I transitioned at the end of the presidency at Macomb into a role called Executive in Residence at Oakland University. And outreach, in particular into Macomb County, was important to them. And this was at the time, just as we were drifting into this horrible recession, near depression, across the country, and especially in Michigan and Macomb County. And one of the things we knew we had to try to get a handle on was business sentiment. How bad was it? How depressed were they? I mean, horror stories here. There were actually, and this is something, since you're not in the state any longer, you would know, but there's barely a single community bank left in Macomb County. Every community bank you would have known when you were here was forced to close. We lost 7 community banks in Macomb County through this awful time period. So the question really uppermost on most people's minds, where is business? What are the prospects? Are we turning the corner? And I at this time was strictly with Oakland University, not the county executive's office, but the college had always had a great working relationship with the chambers of commerce. So I asked if the heads of the chambers in the county would come together and just explore this idea. What if we surveyed your members, and just tried to find out quickly how they felt, not just about today, but what do they see something down the road 6 months from now, and so on. SurveyMonkey, as we've talked about, now existed. It was a very easy thing to do. So long story short, and assisted by a doctoral intern that I was supervising that particular semester, we put together a survey, a business climate survey, field tested it with a small group of people, open-ended survey, not a scientifically selected sample, but just come one, come all, kind of like an institution would survey all its students and take the responses you get. But between the Chambers of Commerce, Civic Leadership Development Organization, and the county's Office of Planning and Economic Development, we had access to over 4,000 emails of business people in this immediate, who did either lived, worked, or did business in Macomb County. Through SurveyMonkey, we sent out the survey, 3-week period, very quick and to the point survey. First time out had over 500 responses to the survey. Great response rate. That immediately caught the media's interest. And our partners said, please replicate this every 6 months because we kept asking them, how are things looking to you 6 months from now, and so on. And let's do it until we feel maybe the bottom has been reached in this recession. And we did that, and it did look through the survey responses that we had reached bottom. And in fact, I really delight in this last survey that we took in December of 2011 that we reported out on in January of 2012, because the forecasts were way ahead of their time as far as businesses turning the corner and starting to get better. And now all the news stories we're hearing today about things getting better said that's what they told us back in that survey.
So it was predictive.
It was very predictive, very much so.
Interesting. Specifically, what were you looking for? You've touched on a few things, but can you expand?
Well, I brought a copy of the little report, and I'm going to mention this to our students. If they would like to replicate this survey, they're more than welcome to do it. On the Oakland University website, if they put in the URL oakland.edu/climate survey, no spaces, they'll actually see on the Oakland University website the reports from all 4 business climate surveys that we've done, so they can get a feel for what it is. The most recent one, which is published in January of 2012, is here. But what we, and as with any process, we'd like to believe it gets better over time. But what we produced in this survey, what we were looking for, are what we called quick facts. And if the students go to that website and simply look on the the second page of that climate survey, they'll see a list 2 pages long of bulleted points that came from that survey that gave us a really sharp picture of what, in this particular survey, some 560 business owners and business leaders told us about what the condition of their business was, and more importantly, where it was headed. But we also, remembering that the university had a hand in this, we also asked questions about the degree of satisfaction that these companies had with the convenient access to educational programs. If there was a program they felt they didn't have convenient access to, what was it? Were they finding any skill sets that were in short supply? Were they had unfilled vacancies? And if so, what were they? So in addition to this general climate information, from an academic perspective, we were also asking them questions about what might be missing in the educational landscape and how we could find a need and fill it.
Yeah. Something that's interesting over your several conversations now, one thing that you've emphasized is the importance of knowing your community and knowing the needs of your community. And another thing that we've talked about is being an intellectual resource for the community. And now you've touched on the interest of the media and the opportunity to create relationships with the media and gain positive coverage from the media. So something like a survey is actually serving all of those goals and needs that you laid out earlier today. So that's interesting. Since the BCS was not a scientific survey, you've worked with those results. Were they reliable?
Yeah, they really were. And in fact, one of the things we tested for in our second survey, which was done 6 months after the first, in the first survey, we asked people to project things like would they experience sales growth, sales stability, sales decline, employment growth, stability decline. We asked them to project that out 6 months. When we did the second survey, we asked them to look back compared to 6 months ago and said, have your sales increased, decreased, stayed the same, employment? Almost every single characteristic that they projected when they reported the actual experience was within like 3 to 5 percentage points of what they had projected. So, I mean, it highly is predictive. Is that surprising? My answer is no. Because I really believe that most business people, especially smaller business people, they've got a handle on their business or they wouldn't be in business.
Right.
And they, looking out 6 months, it wasn't like, well, tell me the next 10 years. But I think most business people have a pretty good sense of what the next 6 months might look like. So highly reliable.
You know, one of my favorite books is something called The Wisdom of Crowds, and you're reminding me of that because what you're showing is instead of listening to some economist that's on Wall Street or in Washington, you can get the same kind of economic insight by surveying the business community, and it's obviously more focused on your own community. So that's kind of nice. I'd recommend that book, The Wisdom of Crowds, to anybody. It's a great a great resource in understanding what you can learn from a community if you study it. Okay, so how would you compare and contrast the Macomb Opinion Survey and the Business Climate Survey? And also, why do you think those kinds of surveys are so essential to an institutional advancement IA program?
Yeah. Well, as we said, one was a scientifically drawn sample and the other one was open-ended, so that's a difference in methodology. But setting that methodology aside, the Business Climate Survey was much easier to implement, in part because it was not a scientific sample and because we had new tools like SurveyMonkey. Secondly, it was so much faster to interpret. We actually used because SurveyMonkey or any tool like that tells you exactly how many responses are coming in at any point in time. We knew if it was necessary to send out a reminder email or something like that, which we wound up doing. But more importantly, it was the mechanics built into it, the cross tabulations, everything else, just allowed for much more interpretation than we were ever able to do with the Macomb Opinion Survey. What was surprising and maybe shouldn't have been is that the media interest in the Business Climate Survey was immediately far greater than we ever had in the early days of the Macomb Opinion Survey. But I think part of that, in fact, was driven by the economic circumstances. Because where the Macomb Opinion Survey was about community attitudes, the attitude of most people was so significantly influenced by the economic climate over the last few years that everybody was interested in when is business getting better or is it getting better? And so any sign that it was getting better was really in good shape.
Let's talk about the concept of community conversations. What are those? Yeah,
that's interesting. It's kind of a focus group on steroids, I guess.
Yeah.
A lot of people are interested in or are familiar with focus groups, but here are some of the differences that I see. Typically, focus groups are singular, or maybe you run a couple of them. The concept of a community conversation is really to have multiple groups explore the same subjects, maybe even in different settings. For a college that serves a large district, you might find, for example, that there are differences of opinion to the extreme north or south or east or west. Focus groups sometimes try to draw representatives from north, south, east, and west into one group. Whereas a community conversation would say, let's go have 4 conversations, one in the north, one in the south, one in the east, one in the west. So rather than getting an average of attitudes, you wind up getting very specific attitudes of subsections in the population. So that's one thing. Secondly, focus groups are typically questions and answers. Community conversations are more interactive. There's a lot more back and forth among the individuals in the group and also with the facilitator and with the participants in the group. But more importantly, focus groups, at least as I'm familiar with them, typically are designed to elicit reaction or sentiment or something like, how does this commercial strike you? How does this do it? The purpose of a community conversation is not just to get reaction, but to see if a consensus can be formed or to see if priorities could be developed when given multiple choices of things. The other thing about a community conversation is oftentimes they're iterative, and that is the same people might be brought back 2 or 3 times to take whatever you've discussed in the first session to its next level. So it's a much more engaging, much more interactive, much more focused on results, consensus, and so on, rather than a focus group is kind of more one way, tell us what you think, tell us what you feel. I would suggest if someone wants to learn more about a community conversation, the organization in Michigan, at least, that I think really brought this to the forefront was an organization called the Center for Michigan, who held countless numbers, I mean some 100+ community conversations around all of the state over a compressed period of time to gauge sentiment on some very important social issues in the state. So by going to the Center for Michigan website, folks could learn more about a community conversation.
Now, sometimes there's a reluctance to do the community conversations because there's a fear of confrontation or a fear of being put on the spot or criticized. What has your experience been? Is that a legitimate fear, or does it not happen so often?
I actually volunteered for the Center for Michigan to personally facilitate several of those sessions. Mm-hmm. So I've had some direct experience with it. First of all, the preparation of the group is important. The first probably 15 minutes was to talk about rules for brainstorming and all of those kind of things that other groups have.
Yeah.
We're not here to make judgments. Everybody's opinion is valued. We're not here to, criticize the other. And I found in the ones that I facilitated an incredible amount of respect that people had for each other. So I'm not saying that some may not have deteriorated into that.
Yeah.
If they do, I don't know, have a bailout strategy, I would guess. But the ones that I facilitated, people, especially when you kind of reviewed the ground rules in the beginning, were very, very respectful of that. The other thing was, which got them more engaging, remember this was a move toward consensus. So people were allowed to vote. We actually had questions where they were forced to rank, pick the top 3 or to take these 10 things and tell me your top 3, and then we put them together. And the conversation then debated, or I shouldn't say debated, it changed to a debate about maybe why my impression wasn't in the top 3 that the rest of the group had. And but again, the facilitation is important, the upfront is important, but it's a great tool for drawing out more than just a yes, no, or Likert scale reading on a question.
Last question. The surveys and focus groups and these community conversations that we've talked about are great tools for learning and listening. Are there other benefits to doing this that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, in an area of positioning, but once again, it's a great positioning tool, whether it's a survey or a face-to-face meeting. People believe you're interested in what they have to say. That's always important. Mm-hmm. They see the college as this intellectual resource, which we've talked about before. But I'll tell you the other 2 things that I found. One is that we develop stronger partnerships as a result of working with people on these surveys and in the community conversations. And I can tell you, as strong as the college's reputation was with our chambers of commerce, I think that the relationship I was able to build with them through the business climate survey was even stronger because they were an active partner in making this happen. The other thing is, as 2 of the chambers reps told me, they're always on the hook to prove to their members that being a member of the chamber is worthwhile. Well, they couldn't wait to dump back out to all their members the results of this survey that they helped to make happen.
Yeah.
So they delighted their customer in the way in which we hope we delighted ours. The last thing, and we never were able to really get this to a high level, but I think if an institution became good at this listening, it might even be a possible revenue source for them to do it on a contract basis.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's wrap up for today. From what you've shared today, I think it's fair to say that for a community college, listening to the community has to be part of our DNA. It's not something that we should do once in a while, but really a practice of doing business. And that it's not an event. We don't just set out and say, okay, let's do a survey, and okay, now that's done, and so we can go on to our business. But really, it's a mindset. Is that fair, Al, to look at it that way?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's critical to create a program for listening to the community that's systematic and that's planned over time and is frequent enough to help you to track trends and track change. And you've mentioned that the best ways to do that are public opinion surveys, business climate surveys, and then the face-to-face conversations. Our next session is going to focus on relating to our key stakeholders and also relating to the news media. So I think before the next session, it's helpful for the students to take a look back at the coverage that their institution has received over the last year, the last 2 years, with a specific eye towards seeing how the news media is affecting or influencing the view that stakeholders have of the institution. One of the things that I think a mistake that sometimes is made is viewing the news media as an audience. The news media is not an audience per se. The news media is a conduit to reach your key stakeholders. And can be used effectively. You can't always get them to report the things you want or in the way that you want, but generally, if you have legitimate news, you can get them interested in that legitimate news and help you to get a message out to the public. So we'll talk about some of those things next time. Thanks very much, Al.
Thanks, Kathy.